Hello and welcome again to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are focused this week on August the 26th, 1901, which is the date that the American Standard Version of the Bible was released. And we are enjoying some conversation today with Dr. Mark Ward, who is a YouTuber and writer and wears a bunch of different hats and is really very much involved in this particular subject matter and has spent a good bit of time of his career following along on biblical translations. So, Dr. Ward, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to sort of visit my sort of home state. The Ward family hailed many decades ago from Mississippi.
Yes, well, when we get through recording, Mississippi's not a state, it's a club. So we'll figure out how to get connected one way or
Okay.
the other before it's over with. So when we talk about the idea of biblical translations, let's just start at a real basic part of that. What do we mean by biblical translation, and how does that differ between people of the Catholic faith and Orthodox faith and the general Protestant world that all would have kind of different definitions for that? Is that
Well,
a
let
is
me,
that a big launch question, or is that okay to?
sure. Um, and I think I can answer it in 3,800 words or less. We'll see what I can do.
Fantastic, go.
I'd actually like to zoom back in time before there were any Christian traditions and go
Okay.
back to the time of the Jews when when a large portion of the population of the Jewish race was speaking Greek.
Mm,
The idea arose, and we don't know all the history. We have what seems to be a fabulous, that is, seems like a fable, description of how this happened, but we know it did happen. They made a translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that was inspired by God in Hebrew, written down over around a millennium by various writers such as Moses and Isaiah, etc. They translated that into Koine Greek. Now, I have people critiquing my pronunciation of the word Koine.
uh-huh.
I won't get into why I do it that way. I could say Kini or whatever they say in modern Greek, but Greek has had an outsized influence on the world. My daughter and I are learning modern Greek right now in the Duolingo app, and I've
Well,
got all my pronunciations confused now. The impulse for translation, in other words, goes back before Christian history, and
mm,
when Jesus and the apostles come along, a bunch of Jews, including them, are speaking Greek along
mhm,
with probably Aramaic. I mean, Jesus
mhm,
uses some Aramaic words in the Gospels, but the New Testament ends up being written in Greek. And when they quote the Old Testament, they frequently, though not always, appear to be quoting the Septuagint, the
mhm.
Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that is pre Christian. So not only is there a precedent among believers in Yahweh, that is the Jews, that we translate the Bible and it's still God's word, but that precedent was in a way baptized by Jesus and the apostles. And so early on in Christian history, there started to be translations of the Bible
Mhm.
in Syriac and Coptic and other ancient languages. Of course, Latin ended up having an outsized influence on the West, and the Greek Bible stuck around because you had the Septuagint of the Old Testament and then the Greek New Testament. But the Protestant viewpoint is,
Mhm.
that it's the Hebrew and the Greek that were inspired, and that translations ought to derive from it. If you want to ask now what has happened among different Christian traditions, the Orthodox tend toward seeing the Greek Septuagint as authoritative. That is not without precedent even in the West. Augustine spoke that way. Augustine, for whom I have a ton of respect.
Mhm.
I don't share his bibliology. I do take a Protestant viewpoint. Roman Catholics have actually come around to, practically speaking, more or less the same viewpoint as Protestants, that Bible translations ought to be made from the originals, the Hebrew and the Greek. But for many centuries, up until really quite recently, they treated the Latin Vulgate done by Jerome, based sort of on older, it's called Itala translations. They treated
Mhm.
that as authoritative and actually translated from Latin into English and other languages. So to sum up, boy, I mean, it's just such a huge field.
I know, yes.
because God inspired the Bible in Hebrew and in Greek, that almost just necessitates Bible translation, because there's not going to be, I would argue, not a single person in the history of the world has spoken both of those languages as a native speaker, because by the time the New Testament came around, Hebrew was not the common spoken language of the regular people, as best I can tell. This is kind of complex. I've got a book on my desk somewhere that's talking about this. So translation is kind of built into the religion. It's kind of demanded by the very nature of the text that God inspired.
Wow. So that's the idea of translation from one language to the other. And but we also, when we talk about translation, speak a little bit on kind of the idea, and then we'll get kind of around to our subject for today, or any other subject we want to chase rabbits on. But um, what is the interpretation thought process between word for word and thought for thought? Because somewhere in there is the answer that most translations, it seems, have gone through, right? I mean, if
Yeah.
I've had somebody explain it to me one time, if I just spoke to you in Hebrew, you'd kind of think you were listening to Yoda, right? I mean, it doesn't
Yeah.
follow the way that your English speaking ears might want to be able to hear it. So there's so many moving parts, it seems to me, on this
Right.
idea of coming up with a translation of the Bible that somebody might buy off a shelf somewhere.
Yeah.
Big question,
This
I know, but
This is a difficult question to answer for anyone who hasn't studied another language at all.
mm,
About the closest I can, have people come is, if you want to get a sense for this, go on YouTube or TikTok or whatever. These are serious scholarly resources I'm about to recommend.
right.
And I just saw this yesterday, actually. A woman who said, if English was like Swedish, this is the way it would sound. And then she ends up speaking in what sounds to us like a very stilted way, like, good day, how head is your? And
Mm,
because that reflects the word order in the Swedish for these common phrases. So that sounds incredibly awkward to us. In fact, to the point where you're not even sure what this person means, and you want to
right.
know how head is theirs, like what's wrong with them. But we recognize that languages have different word orders, they have different syntax.
Mm,
They have different idioms and expressions. And actually, when people want to know, should I be more word for word or thought for thought, I
hmm
used to invest myself, I would say, in that fight, because among Christians it
mm,
is kind of a fight.
right.
But I'll skip to the end and then go back to the middle. Where I've landed is, I want the more word for word literal translations, and I want the more thought for thought translations. I even want the paraphrases. I'm listening through the Message finally for the first time in my life, and I'm actually really enjoying it. It sounds a lot
Mm,
more natural in English. Going back to the middle, then, if you think of literally every element of language, from word order to the number of syllables to the length of the sentence, you can always try to reflect more of those elements of language in your translation. But you're going to come up against difficulties. You're going to hit a point where you break the language into which you're translating. And that means that a judgment call is required on the part of every translator. And that means, because the Bible doesn't give us direction on exactly how to do this, its
hmm
own translations, when it uses the Septuagint, are not always literal. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. That means that humans have to make a judgment call. And I would rather be pragmatic than principled in this case. Sounds really odd coming from me. I'm a rather conservative individual. But I really got so tired of the fight among Christians over this when I realized there are times when I want the literal translations, namely when
mm,
I'm digging really deep into individual verses, individual words.
right.
And there are times when I just want to kind of skim across the surface because I'm trying to cover as much ground as possible, and the thought for thought translations are helpful there. Or I'll just give my one classic example and then I'll stop jawing. Psalm 16, in the King James, which I grew up on, it says, "The lines are fallen unto me in pleasant places. Yea, I have a goodly heritage, O Lord." And Honestly, I'm telling the truth. I remember so little about my childhood, but I remember what I used to think the Bible meant. Isn't that strange? And
Huh.
I used to think there are lines falling and they're hitting me in just the right spot. Ooh, right there. Yes, the lines are falling unto me in pleasant places. Well, I was reading along in the NIV, as an adult, a young man, and it said, and the NIV, by the way, is less literal. The King James is more literal. The NIV said, "The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Yes, I have a good inheritance, O Lord." And I just slapped my forehead. I was at a school in West Virginia at a conference speaking. I still remember this. It was precious to me that now I get it. Now I understand what they were trying to say. I needed the more thought for thought interpretive translation to even understand. So I see value in both approaches, and I wish we would stop fighting about it as Christians.
How about that? Well, hey, we're really enjoying our conversation here with Dr. Mark Ward, and we're talking about Bible translations and using the date of the American Standard Version as a kind of a portal for us to jump in this dialogue and conversation. So, is it fair then to say, or do you think it's kind of a standard operating procedure to say, if you really want to know why that particular sentence structure or verse structure is something that you're looking at in that particular book that you're reading in the Bible, then it may very well be that you turn to the front and you can see who the interpreter was that actually put together that chapter and understand, well, if you want to know why that happened, it could have been Professor X, Y, or Z at ABC Seminary is the one that was in charge of this particular translation. And he is the one that came up with that sentence structure. So take it up with them. I mean, is that
Well, yeah,
oversimplified or is that silly?
I mean, the most important point here is humans had to do it. God does not inspire translations. He never said
Hmm.
he would, and if he did, then he didn't tell us how to know which translations are inspired.
Right.
No, he left that to us the same way he leaves the preaching of the gospel to flawed vessels such as ourselves. So, yes, individuals have to make choices. Where I would probably frame things a little differently is
Hmm.
any translation worth its salt, and there are a lot of good salty translations out there. They try very hard to have a multi denominational committee of
Hmm.
translators and multiple levels of checks so that no one person or one denominational perspective can overrule the others. Most of the time, when I hear people on the internet complaining, and I know that's redundant, but they complain about this or that translation having this or that bias, I go and I look and I think, no, the most we could say is that among available options for translating this particular phrase, yeah, they chose the one that is a legitimate option, but
Mm.
that does cohere best with their viewpoint. And we're
Mm.
not talking about passages where there are 38 options and they chose one. We're talking about places where there are maybe two legitimate options of how to translate, and both are orthodox, but they chose the one that, yeah, fits their overall theology better.
Yeah.
That's not something to get upset about. I'll give a quick example. I won't be specific about a passage, but I had people online complaining about the English Standard Version, which is actually based on the Revised Standard Version, which is actually
Mhm.
based on the American Standard Version, which we'll get to, which is based on the English Revised Version, which is based on the King James Version, which is based ultimately on Tyndale, who actually did borrow from Wycliffe some. Anyway, the ESV was being charged with this or that terrible sin. And I went back and I looked at the RSV, of which it's a revision, and the
Mhm.
RSV, which was done by a different segment of the Christian church, shall we say,
Mm.
had the very same thing. So the ESV didn't actually change it. And if you're going to pose a conspiracy theory in which bad people are trying to monkey with the Bible, it's really hard to explain then how the bad people of today supposedly went back into the 1950s and got the RSV translators on their side.
So let's talk about the most well-known, I guess, well read, the kind of the cornerstone of all translations, right? And go back to the King James. I mean,
Yeah.
um, from the King James, then. King James had the Apocrypha in it, didn't it? In
Yeah.
the middle part of it when it first came
Yep.
out, right? And so, um, outside of theological components, what really kind of made folks start to think and say, "Hey, I think we might need to get us a new translation here on the quote unquote authorized version of the Bible."
Well, you said you teach political science, is that correct?
Well, history and political science, yes,
History
but
and political science. Well, that's
mainly history.
perfect.
But right.
Yeah. So, okay. So, either way, I can emphasize either one. I think history
Both.
and political
Okay.
science are the reason that we ultimately needed to make a revision of the King James. And here's what I mean.
Mm,
The King James achieved dominance, utter dominance in the English speaking church, despite the existence of other English translations. It itself is a revision of the 1568 Bishop's Bible, and the Geneva Bible, which was
hmm
done by conservative evangelical Protestants in Geneva,
hmm
who had, paid for their Protestant convictions. It was done in 1599. That was also on the market. Why did the King James come to dominate? I think the answer is in history and political science. It's
Okay.
only when you have a king who is also the defender of the faith and head
hmm
of the church that you're able to herd all the cats and say, this is the Bible that's appointed to be read in churches. And the churches in which it was appointed to be read were controlled by the king, ultimately speaking.
Sure.
So you could achieve dominance in a way that you just couldn't today. Like, even if Billy Graham came back from the grave and said,
Mm.
we need to use the NIV, all of us, I can guarantee you that not everybody would get on board.
Yeah, I think that's a safe. I think that's a
The-
safe thing for you to assume.
There's no mechanism by which that the scripture gives us to herd all those cats for this particular purpose. So we end up with the multiplicity of translations. Well, for these, accidental and I would say providential historical reasons and political reasons, we ended up with
hmm
a one ring to rule them all translation. What that what that practically meant was it was difficult to move away from. You have that collective action problem that I've heard economists talk about. Yes, it would be better for everybody if we would move. Even in the 1830s, Noah Webster, I have got it on my shelf. He made a update of the King James because he saw the same problems I see today, and that are the source of my book, Authorize the Use and Misuse of the King James Bible, and my YouTube channel. For years, I talked about these things. The King James, as language changes, began to have dead words and false friends, words we don't know, like besom,
hmm
chambering, and emerald, and words we don't know, like halt, remove, and commend. Things that words we still use, but were used in different senses in the King James.
hmm
Intelligent folks who knew their Bibles and knew English knew this was happening, but it's very difficult to change such a huge ship. Finally, the problems became undeniable enough, the readability problems, that, and here we're going to get into the ASV,
Okay.
we we have we have a groundswell of opinion, that we've got to make a change. We've got to make a revision. And so in the 1870s, in the early 1870s in Britain, there was a committee put together to produce what became the English Revised Version. And then that, in 14 years afterward, became in America the American Standard Version. And their motivation was largely the updating of the English because every language changes over time. But they also ended up making some scholarly changes, especially in the area of New Testament textual criticism. They made some different choices about which variants in the Greek to translate than the King James translators did. So there are these two major axes upon which this
hmm
revision is turning that it became the ASV.
Well, who is we? And who is the we that said and don't and rang the bell and said, you know, I want to pull together the people. It's just like, and this is a silly analogy, right? But I mean, the Oscars got started around at a dinner table, apparently, one night with Mary Pickford and Errol Flynn, right? And saying we ought to figure out who ought to be get the best picture, and because we is who we say we are, right? And so who was the we that kind of dinged the bell and said that we ought to do this? Was it all, were they all Protestants? Were they all people in any particular type of theological bent, one way or the other, that thought this is something we need to do?
I'm gonna hedge a little bit and say history is not my strong suit, with
Okay,
apologies to the history professor.
hey,
I
he
did
doesn't
some
know
boning
the
up
answer.
before this interview. Well, so the Church of England, and I know some of the individual scholars that were involved.
Okay,
In England, it was the Church of England who had that kind of authority, and Cambridge
right.
and Oxford were the main institutions where scholars of suitable quality could be gathered together to make
Hmm.
this kind of revision work. I know some of the individual scholars who worked on it. B.F. Westcott and Fenton John Anthony Hort were major figures in the New Testament, and they're well known, Westcott and Hort, to this day as really the progenitors slash popularizers of the modern approach to New Testament textual criticism. That is, the
Okay.
principles by which we decide when various Greek manuscripts differ. If some say the wise men came and found baby Jesus, and some say the wise men came and saw baby Jesus, we got to make a choice and put it in our translation. Westcott and Hort worked on those principles, and I read their very detailed introduction to the New Testament where they talk these things through. A beautiful book, by the way.
Mm.
F.H.A. Scrivener, Frederick Henry Ambrose Scrivener, was a major scholar on that committee as well. An incredible guy with vast amounts of knowledge. I mean, the institutions in England are still producing very intelligent folks, and back then they most certainly did. So some of the best and brightest were placed on this committee. And to the best of my knowledge, here's where I'm hedging. The
Mm.
officials in the Church of England were behind it. It had official imprimatur from power structures within England. It wasn't just a random group of people around a dinner table.
Okay. So how do we go from this English Revised Version to the American Revised Version?
They came to an agreement, the Americans and Brits back then, before 1900, that the Americans would wait a certain period of time for the
Uh,
English Revised Version to stabilize itself
okay.
and to achieve adoption, which it never really did, unfortunately. It actually has been widely panned, I would say. It just didn't sing like the King James did.
Mm.
But the American Standard Version did have a different experience, and we'll get to its future. But the New Testament came out in 1900, and then the Old Testament in 1901, and now I am suddenly doubting my own memory. You'll
Mm.
have to go check that out.
That's okay. That's why
It's
we
called the
have references.
1901, yeah, 1901 American Standard Version. Uh, I have seen pictures of the Chicago Tribune, I believe it was, that actually printed the entire New Testament. This was a
Really?
big deal in the US, and the copies of the ASV sold out extremely quickly. I, I've never heard anyone say how much adoption it had in churches.
Okay.
The King James preface itself talks about this. When you meddle with people's religious tradition, you meddle with what the King James translators call their freehold, that is their inheritance, and people don't like it. And the King James preface is actually really witty to the point of acid. It says that cavil, if it do not find a hole, will make one. Petty objections to new translations or revisions of translations are just going to come up over and over again, they say. And then they say that even if people don't like their inheritance, they don't want to see it changed.
Mm. Right.
It's hilarious. It's really difficult to read, but once you realize what he's saying, you're like, oh my goodness, this is like really biting. And I think that's what happened, that people were happy to read it, but in ecclesiastical settings, the King James just wasn't going to be dislodged. That took
Mm.
another several decades.
Hmm. Hmm. So the American Standard Version was that, did people figure out how to spell things with an S and a C instead of a C and an S? And were they using idioms of things that would might make more sense in an American style? And were there Americans that actually made up that committee? Did they go back to the regular
Yes,
seminaries to wherever to go pull scholars from to be able to write those?
yes. The church historian Philip Schaff put together
Hmm.
this committee, and it was multi-denominational at the time, even including Unitarians. Actually, there was a Unitarian on the ERV committee as well, George Vance Smith. So they were they were doing their best as Americans to put together a responsible multi-denominational committee the same way that most translations, serious translations today do.
And did they do it kind of like in the same way that those original scholars, that Andrews or any of the rest of them that way back on the King James, they just kind of, in a practical way, did they just kind of divide it up and say, you folks go check this and you guys do that, you get a draft and some of the rest of us will review and then we'll all meet? I mean, it didn't take 7 years, right, like the King James did, or however many
Yeah.
years it was to be able to pull all that off. But did they kind of structure it generally that way?
I mean, that is always the way it is with a serious revision. You're going
Okay.
to have Old Testament specialists and New Testament specialists. It's very rare in my experience that anyone will even claim to have equal facility in both of the major biblical languages.
Mhm.
So you'll have Old Testament editors and New Testament editors to this day. And yes, I lack specific knowledge regarding the structure of the ASV committee,
That's okay.
but that I fully expect that is the way they put
Yeah.
it together.
Yeah. So how did they deal with, so once the the English Revised Version, the ERV started to come, remind me, and this again, this may not be something that it is germane to our conversation, but the Apocrypha, if I remember right, one of the last big revisions that happened of the King James, is that when they actually took the Apocrypha out of the Bible itself, or was it still in there or
Yeah.
not in there, or
You,
seems like somewhere along the way that it stayed in for quite some period of time until it just didn't. That's
so the
maybe a
history
silly way to say it, but
No, it's fine. The history professor is asking the exegete a bunch of historical questions, which are very, very good questions,
oh,
and I don't know all the answers.
well,
I
that's
know that
okay.
the Apocrypha was in the original 1611, absolutely, and I know that over time ended up being dropped out. What I don't know is exactly when and where. What
Hmm.
I gather, my general impression would be
Yeah,
that there was no program or decision because there was no Christian pope in English speaking church circles to say, now the Apocrypha is out. It it happened slowly and piecemeal, but by the time I came around, certainly in 1980, evangelical Christians were not publishing the Apocrypha, that's for sure.
right.
And yeah, I think it's ironic that a bunch of the people that you can't not know, the King James onlyists out there, people who love the Lord and love the Bible, they think the Apocrypha is something they shouldn't even touch, but it actually was in the original King James Version.
Yeah, yeah. And so it was, but when it was there, it was set apart as its own section. It wasn't integrated. Like if I
Yes.
go get a copy of a Catholic Bible today, I can see the Book of Judith is right there in the middle of what of the Old Testament, right? I mean, it's integrated into that in the Catholic. In this Bible, though, it was separate, I think, in its own section that said, "Hey, here's the Apocrypha. We're not kicking it to the curb necessarily in the same way that maybe Athanasius or others would have said. We understand this is different and this is here, and but we're giving it to you, but we do understand there's some differentiators in that."
Yeah, actually, the Catholics themselves call it the Deuterocanon,
Hmm.
and they do separate it from the rest of the canon. And what something people don't understand from Christian history is that the Council of Trent, which in the
Hmm.
Catholic Church is a response to the Protestant Reformation, they were the ones who took an intra-Catholic debate over the canonical
Right.
status of these deutero, which means secondary canonical books, and turned it into, I would say, a wedge issue between Catholics and Protestants. Up
Hmm.
until that day, there were Catholics, and even at the Council of Trent, Catholics in good standing who didn't think the Deuterocanon was part
Right.
of the canon. But then it becomes, at the Council of Trent, a point of anathema if you deny that the Deuterocanon is part of the canon. But still, unless I'm much mistaken, when I've seen Catholic Bibles, the Deuterocanon is separated, not included within the 39 books of the Old Testament. I absolutely could be wrong. It's been a little while. I do
Well,
most
that's
of my
okay.
Bible stuff in digital form anyway.
The one on my shelf is it's integrated in there, but that doesn't mean that
Interesting.
that mine would be a part of that to do. Yeah. So for any of our folks who are watching and listening as well, go back and check some of our previous episodes that we have, particularly in our Christian History Chronicles, and we have a great conversation on the Council of Trent, and where you can refresh even more than that. And one of the things, as you were saying, that I thought was very interesting was that there were some pretty close votes within that council on a lot of things that you today would say, oh, the Catholics have always been for that, and the Protestants have never been for that. There was some tighter votes than you might think on
Right.
some of the thought process, but I think makes it even more interesting than that. So once the we kind of got an American version and a revised English version of these, then what goes on in other groups going forward in the 1900s and later than that, they go, I think we need to go back and do it again. And so we need to
Yeah.
get this CSV, or we need to get this CSB, or we need to get this ESV, or
Right.
we need to get this
Yeah.
NIV. I mean, any of these, what's going on in folks' mindsets that are kind of driving that?
Yeah. So I'm an evangelical and I love evangelicals. I do tend to think that evangelicals' overall conservatism ended up contributing to there being some of the last on the new translation train. It was
Mm,
more mainline Protestants who put together the Revised Standard Version, which in 1957 was released as a revision of the American Standard Version.
hmm
And that was the first Bible translation in modern times that, as far as I have gathered, started to achieve adoption in churches. And I do think that by that time, it just had become really undeniable that English had changed enough that people needed to have, the Bible translation they used revised.
hmm
And then the evangelicals finally started getting on board with the new international version. And this process started around the same time, 50s and 60s. Actually,
hmm
there was a Seattle-based businessman, and I'm about an hour north of Seattle
Okay.
myself, and he was trying to give the gospel to another businessman in a hotel in Portland. And he started quoting the King James to the guy, and the guy just got red-faced and burst out laughing. And he said, that's the strangest thing I ever heard. He'd never heard talk like that.
Right.
And
I'm not
on,
Shakespeare, right?
yeah, on the one hand, a lot of Christians still have the impulse, well, he ought to learn. There are
Mm,
technical terms that you need to learn in every field. If you're an engineer, you're going to learn about bridge stresses and whatever. But if you're a Christian, you need to learn King James English. But I think the lion's share of evangelicals knew both theologically and I would say intuitively that that's not the way the Great Commission is set up. Go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to speak an older form of English so they can understand me. That's not what the Great Commission is.
it's not in
So,
mine. Okay. It's
yeah.
not my translation.
So Howard Long went back to his pastor in a Dutch Reformed denomination and said, we got to do something. We need to translate the Bible into English. And he ended up, that pastor, De Jong was his last name, or De Jong. I don't know how to pronounce all my Dutch names. He
That's
took
right.
that back to his classis, I think, whatever their presbytery is in their Dutch Reformed Church. And that ended up going to a multi denominational committee wisely that became the new international version. And that is what really brought adoption of a modern translation into the evangelical English
hmm
speaking Christian church. And then we get something of a reaction that takes us back a little bit to the King James tradition, because the NIV translators said to themselves, we're going to try to forget that we grew up on the King James. We don't
mm
want to use it as our default because we want to translate into English that the normal person can understand. And I value that very highly. I've got multiple copies of the NIV. I've read through it multiple times. I love the NIV very, very much. It's precious to me. But there were folks out there that I also understand where they're coming from who said,
hmm
well, we like the King James tradition. They were a bit more literal than the NIV, not like the NIV was totally interpretive and paraphrastic, but it was not as literal as it could be. We want to be more literal. And so they looked back to the Tyndale tradition, and that's where we get the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible of 1971 and of 1995 and of 2020. That's where we get the Legacy Standard Bible of recent years. That's where we get the New King James of the early
hmm
80s. It's going back directly to the King James. So there are a lot of choices now that are more literal and a number that are less literal, like the New Living Translation, which actually does have its basis in the American Standard Version as well, but is definitely more interpretive, less literal as a translation. Now we have a whole spectrum, including the CSB, which is kind of like right in the middle. It was aiming right between readability and accuracy, and I think it hit
Hmm.
that spot and did very well. I like to say we have usefully different spots on the spectrum of literal to not so literal to interpretive. We have translations on usefully different spots on that spectrum. And the major evangelical English translations, I use them all. I use them all the time, and I commend their use to everybody.
Mm. Look at there. How about that? So, if you had to take a wild guess, how many uh, purchasable, is that a word? I don't know. How many
Yeah.
different versions of the Protestant Bible could I go and purchase right now that are in active production?
Yeah, okay. You've set up several filters there,
Yes.
purchasable and in
Yeah.
active production. Unfortunately, Amazon print on demand means that there are probably way
Well,
more than I could ever count. But
right.
I think though what you might mean to say
Yeah.
is prominent enough that I could feasibly buy them at a bookstore and
Yes.
they could be used in my church.
Particular,
And I would
pretend Lifeway was still had bookstores,
yeah,
right? I mean, I could walk in today and get some, uh, uh, a dozen, pretty
I
much.
would say okay, and then we have to distinguish between evangelical versus Catholic
Hmm.
translations. Among evangelical translations, it'd be maybe 8 or 10. You can still
Hmm.
buy the King James, of course. You can get the New King James. You can get the ESV. You can get the CSB. You can get the New Living Translation. You can get the New Evangelical Translation, which tends to be used for its notes, not so much for its translation. So that's kind of like a half.
Okay.
You can get the NIV, you can get the NASB, the Legacy Standard Bible. You can get, did I already say the New Living Translation? I can't remember. So, yeah, around 8 or 10. And then after that, I would say it drops off pretty quickly. You can go
Mm.
look at the Evangelical Christian Publishers Association list of Bible translations like that actually sell. And there's a
Hmm.
pretty stable list of 8 or 10 there. Among Catholic translations, I'm less familiar, but they have several. The New American Bible
Yeah.
is one. The New Jerusalem Bible is another that you can buy in bookstores. But when people say there's an endless number of English translations, well, that's technically true. Which one should I choose among them all? It's overwhelming. Well, that's not really true. It's among those that were done by serious people on committees and actually produced a number of usable editions, we're talking 10.
Yeah. Yeah. My impression is that the people who sit on these committees and or do sit on these committees, whichever way you want to call it, that they really, really take this incredibly serious,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
and they are understanding that they are dealing with what they really understand is the inspired word of God, and
Yeah.
they don't want to play around the edges or play cute by half, right? I
No.
mean,
Yeah.
they're very serious about it.
And and they'll get called on anything that's truly a problem. So the new Revised Standard Version, which comes from the Revised Standard Version, which comes from the American Standard Version, which comes from the English Revised Version, which comes from the King James Version, etc. The new Revised Standard Version came out in an updated edition not that many years ago, just a few years ago. And I
Hmm.
was among a number of evangelicals who cried foul as carefully and as graciously as I could. I listened to the other side to try to get their best case. I cried
Okay.
foul about one particular choice they made in 1 Corinthians 6 on a passage that discusses male homosexuality. And actually, they listened and they changed the footnote. I'm not saying they listened to me personally. I have no idea if they listened to me personally, but I wasn't the only one. There was an evangelical on the committee of largely mainline Protestants who also cried foul. So it's not the kind of thing where you can be sneaky. Once it's
Mm.
published,
Right.
everybody knows what you're saying,
Right.
and once it's published, there are many English speakers who know Greek and Hebrew and know them very well and can make objections. So the scholars keep the other scholars honest, and those
Sure.
scholars in my experience, even the mainline Protestant ones, I heard them talking about the New Revised Standard Version. I'm not mainline Protestant, I'm not on their same page theologically, but did they treat it seriously? Absolutely, they treated their work seriously, and I expect the rest
Right.
of the NRSVUE to be good.
Yes. Well, and that's also why if you're reading, many times you'll be able to see a footnote, right? That'll say,
Right,
this may be in the Masoretic text. This is, by the way, you need to know, this last part of John. In John 8, some of this is here, some of it's not here. You just need to be aware. And we acknowledge that there are some different components of this, but we included it anyway, or we use this version of the Septuagint and whatever. That to me gives a lot of credibility to the things that I'm reading because nobody's saying thou shalt best believe exactly what I'm telling you is exactly right
right,
here. And I
right.
think that it gives a lot of creds to some of that. So
That's a great point.
or whatever that would be. Well, tell us how we can connect with you and follow you on your YouTube channel and get your books and get other things that we would like to use and dig into. Maybe I haven't thought about textual criticism or translations very much, and I'd like to learn more about that. Tell us how we connect to you.
Yeah. A major theme of my YouTube channel, which is Word on Words, is unlocking the embarrassment of riches we have in English Bible translation.
Mm,
And I think a lot of people, if they even bother to use more than one translation, and I don't insist that everybody must, but yeah, I
mm,
think everybody should. If you've got any reading facility at all, pick up more than one. Read a literal one, read a less literal one. I tend to still default to the literal ones as a baseline, but
uh-huh.
if the less literal ones are your baseline, then pick up a literal one. Fine. People get so freaked out about making the choice of the best Bible translation, and they ask me, "What's the best Bible translation?" I just say, "All the good ones, all the good ones."
Right.
So if you don't know what to do when you come across a difference between the NIV and the ESV, then come to my channel and I will talk you through it. There are mainly two possibilities. It's either textual or it's translational. The
Mhm.
textual stuff is much more difficult and complicated. I don't talk about it as much, but I do have a whole series on New Testament textual criticism where I talk through those issues, especially as they relate to the King James only controversy. I have a big heart for King James onlyists. I grew up among them, and they were really
Mhm.
lovely Christians to me who taught me well. I'm
Mhm.
very grateful to them. I disagree with them over their King James onlyism, and I've worked in this book authorized and in a forthcoming book with Baker called What Saith the Lord? King James words we're getting wrong and how to get them right. Or man, I've been mixing up my subtitles because I've got several books coming out.
That's
It's
all right.
something like that. It's called What Saith the Lord. I'll get this right by the next interview. It's coming out in November. I'm teaching people how to spot the effects of language change
Mm.
in their King James Bible, and I think that ends up teaching some good principles of language and, more importantly, of Bible study. And this book that's coming out is based on my 150 false friends in the King James series on YouTube, which took me several years and was a lot of fun. That's the main place where you can encounter me. I also have a newsletter at wordonwords.com that you can sign up for if you'd like to get
Okay.
interesting Bible translation and exegesis type tidbits, along with some humor every once in a
How,
while.
how about that? Fantastic. Well, thank you again for spending time with us today. For folks who are checking this out on our YouTube channel, don't forget to go back to our centerforchristianhistory.com where you can learn more about the things that we are doing, including connecting with good scholars like Dr. Ward who are helping us understand things even more as it relates to Christian history. Thanks for your time.